Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to go over part 2 of the idea of allegory. Realistically, part of the reason I wanted to go over this is because I believe that allegories are one of those things that pretty much flow through in and out of our stories. That we can take symbols and ideas and actually weave them into the narrative. So this gives us a deeper understanding of what we can actually tell in our stories. Our stories, my opinion, shouldn't just be about the events that are happening on the page, but rather what are the meanings behind it? What is the depth that we can add to it so that our readers can walk away thinking about the story that we've told? Now, throughout history, there have been a great number of writers that have added a lot of depth by using allegory. One of the ways that they could do this is that they attach ideas to symbols. So for instance, Aslan, he's a lion, but biblically speaking, Jesus is called the Lion of Judah. The idea Jesus as a saving figure because of what goes on in the story. Keeping the idea consistent throughout the story is one of the ways that we as writers can make sure that our readers understand it. Now, that's not to say that if we have elements in our story, or even if we do a allegory heavy story, that people aren't going to pick and choose what they want to pull out of it. That's something that you're never going to be able to avoid. That's the way readers are. I heard a video from Brandon Sanderson, probably one of the greatest writers of our generation, says that the way he views writing is that he's presenting an idea, but at the end of the day, it's up to the reader to accept or reject elements in that story. As writers, we have to be very careful that we don't expect too much from our readers. And I'm not saying expecting too much as far as their intellectual capacity, but rather they all come in with their own biases. They all come in with their own preconceived notions. And so if we try to do an element of allegory, recognize that not all of those elements are going to land. And we'll get into this a little bit later with the story of Animal Farm. But I just want to make sure that we are starting from the same page, that allegories inherently rely on the reader as being part of the narrative, because we as writers are connecting to that subconscious aspect of their own lived experiences. Only when we're able to connect to those specific aspects are we able to make sure that our allegory actually hits. Our goal as writers is not so that the literary academia can find the allegory or find the meaning in our stories, but rather that the everyday person will recognize it, maybe not necessarily consciously or be able to see it spelled out, but rather subconsciously. That if somebody said, hey, this is what this means, we're able to take a look and say, hey, yes, that's what that means, and I can see how the author is trying to say that. A good example of this is in the movie Jurassic Park. There's a scene, for anybody who hasn't watched it, where the main characters are in a helicopter. And because of wind shears and how the landing pad for the helicopter is situated, there are rapid descents that happens in the helicopter. So the owner of Jurassic Park, Hammond, says, better buckle up because it's a rough drop. Now what ends up happening is that Grant, the main character who we spend a good portion of the story with, he has two parts of a belt buckle, but they are both what are considered female parts of the belt buckle. Typically you have the male and female, but what ends up happening is that the two females aren't able to connect, aren't able to engage the way that they were originally designed for. So what does he end up doing? He ties the two female parts together. What that does is that symbolizes something later on, that in the words of Malcolm, life finds a way. That one of those most famous quotes that we see from time to time pop up. Life finds a way. Just as in the story, the dinosaurs are able to reproduce even though they're all female, it's the symbol of Grant taking the two female parts of the seatbelt and tying them together. Those type of symbols we can be adding to our stories. So now that we've kind of established that, let's get into other ways that allegories have been shown. Like I said on Tuesday, allegories is just not a religious or theological theme, but it can also have political and moral undertones as well. and those are one of the ones that we're going to go over today. Here are just a handful of allegories that pop up when you put it in. I use Goodreads a lot as a way of tracking the books that I've read and how many I'm reading throughout the course of the year. So if we take a look at this, obviously Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is obviously the most famous book for allegories. The second one is Animal Farm. We'll go over an article a little bit later about Animal Farm and the different allegorical aspects of that particular story. Pilgrim's Progress is even more on the nose than Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's something else we're going to go over in the article that I found. Watership Down is one of those ones that it perceives to have an allegorical aspect to it. But if you actually take a look at what the author originally intended, he said in an article that The Guardian came up with, saying that it was just a story about rabbits. But there's a lot of people that are ascribing a deeper meaning to it. And that's not to say that that deeper meaning, it doesn't have truth in it, but rather people are seeing reality and that deeper meaning connect and line up. And that's kind of one of the things that we can end up having in our own stories, is that we're not necessarily trying to purposely create a underlying connection with our stories, but rather when we write our stories well and we rely on reality to be the driving force or the waypoint of how we write our stories, other aspects of truth and reality will fall in line with that. Lord of the Flies is another allegorical aspect of what chaos is or what anarchy could look like. Personally, I see Lord of the Flies as more of what can happen when you have a unstructured group of people. I haven't read this, as you can tell. It's on my list to read, but I haven't read it yet. So hopefully one day I'll take a look at it and do a view on it for the channel. But the point is that it's easy to have thematic elements that can help us tell a deeper story that can connect with our readers on a deeper level. And that's kind of what I want to get with this video, is show that there are ways that we can add elements into our stories to get us into and deeper connected to our readers. So there's a website called yourdictionary.com. Alyssa Serini, her idea of 4 great allegories that everybody should be reading. Let's get into it. An allegory is a poem, story, or image where the characters and events are symbolic and represent greater meaning or truth, particularly religious, moral, or political idea. The purpose of an allegory is to teach the idea or principle or to explain it. Allegory is derived from the Old French allegorie, from the Latin and Greek allegora, meaning speaking about something else. Here they give 4 examples: Pilgrim Progress, Moby Dick, Animal Farm, and Life of Pi. Each one have different purposes and have different goals about what they're trying to do. For instance, Pilgrim Progress is more about an idea of the life of a Christian from a Protestant perspective. Characters are clearly representative of people and concepts that Bunyan implies without naming them more explicitly. Bunyan's treatment of characters in the text used metaphorically to convey his opinion regarding those who are sinners and fools and express the importance to the viewpoint of the reader. For instance, there are characters like Faith, Goodheart. These are characters that help the main characters through their story. And because the author, John Bunyan, is creating that story and is being very explicit about these characters, he shows how these characters are going to play out and how very, very on the nose, how those stories matter and how that is helping the Christian, the main character Christian, along his journey. Moby Dick, this is another one. Herman Melville. I read this like forever ago. But Moby Dick is one of those stories that pretty much a lot of people read because it is a very clear allegory on a number of different ways. Stuff that's not going to be necessarily on the nose are going to be obvious. The Pequod's journey mirrors the one the U.S. took before the Civil War. The story is a reflection of Melville's feeling about America at the time leading up to the war. The conflict occurs between Ahab and the whale is a metaphor for the relationship that man has with God. This is a very on-the-nose type of mindset of what the author is trying to say. But the most of the time when people talk about Moby Dick as a allegory is that they're actually talking about this one, the metaphor of the idea that revenge can become a self-destructive obsession. And that is a huge element of Moby Dick. Literally, spoiler alert for this 100-plus-year-old story, Moby Dick is a extremely old story about how one man, Ahab, is on the look for a white whale. That's why the term white whale comes from, is that obsession that people have. And typically, that obsession will end up destroying the person who has it. And depending on where that person is, can end up destroying so many other people around them. For instance, you have a family or a husband that they have a goal of trying to achieve something. What are they willing to sacrifice to get that achievement? Whether it's money. How many times have we heard stories where the husband has an obsession about making money, only to find once he has reached that point where he is comfortable, where he has the money, that he realizes that he has destroyed every relationship that he's had up to that point. That, yes, has a ton of money. He's financially secure. But now his family doesn't want to speak with him. His kids have zero interest in being part of his life. His wife has left him. These are things that we can easily see in our own lives or the lives of those around us and how they can impact us as people. And this is a very interesting way of saying the same idea, is by showing that we have a character that has a obscene obsession about a particular goal, which in this case of Moby Dick is that white whale, taking out that white whale. Whaling is already a very dangerous idea, but the fact that the white whale is already proven to be a dangerous goal is just another element on top. Animal Farm, George Orwell. This is what I was talking about earlier when talking about the idea that some people take certain things out of an allegory while others aren't. Animal Farm is an allegory example that uses animals on a farm to represent the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II, the actions of Stalin and the revolution of Russia before World War II. The struggles of animals on the farm may be seen as a metaphor for how greed and indifference corrupt an evolution, the dangers that can occur without a smooth transition to people's government, the way in which those in power and positions can manipulate ideologies of society. Now, one of the things that for me, I have read Animal Farm and I have actually pulled my own perspective out of it. And I think this is one of the things that George Orwell is trying to say is that, yes, greed and indifference can corrupt a revolution. But what they fail to mention here is that it is an inevitable fact that greed and indifference will corrupt the revolution. That regardless of how pure the idea of the revolution is, that it will always end up being in the hands of people who are willing to take power. Those that are willing to, as it says here, the way in which those in power positions can manipulate the ideologies of society. People forget that people who desire power are going to be willing to do anything to maintain that power. And that's something as a society that we tend to forget because we want to believe that people have an element of good in them. But the problem is, as I've said previously, people aren't always good, but they are always selfish. The idea is that when we give people power, particularly power to overthrow a previous form of government, that will always end up drawing people who desire power. And at the end of the story, what will end up happening, and I plan on doing Animal Farm in a future video, but what ends up happening is that what we see, or what the characters see, is that there is no difference. There ends up being no difference between the humans in this Animal Farm and the pigs who end up taking over power. So what ends up happening, we have a situation where, yes, there was a goal set for revolution. There was a goal set for a specific alleviation of suffering by the animals. But what ends up happening is that alleviation turns back on itself and ends up corrupting itself, causing more pain and suffering for those around them, particularly those that are willing to put the time and effort to do the work needed for the help of other people. That's not always going to be the case with everybody. But there's a character who ends up killing themselves because they work so hard trying to get the work done to relieve the suffering of other people. You know, Napoleon is that main character who grabs power. And the way that he grabs power is he collects the young and impressionable. Napoleon is a indication of here, and it's a double idea of not just Stalin and the horrors that he committed. But Napoleon, using the name Napoleon, is a reminder that this has been done before, that Napoleon also grabbed power after the revolution. When people are at their weakest, when countries are at their weakest, they are looking for a strong man. Now with Napoleon, things weren't nearly as dire as it was under Stalin, because what ends up happening is that with specific ideologies, people are going to be far more willing to do whatever it takes to get power. And if they have a moral philosophy or perceived moral philosophy behind them, they are always going to be able to commit far more wrong because they can hide behind the shield of that morality. Snowball is the manifestation of Leon Trotsky. Now, what ends up happening here is that there's actually a misunderstanding that Leon Trotsky wasn't as innocent as a lot of people think. Knowing a little bit about the revolution, Leon Trotsky was just as willing to do very horrendous things as Stalin, but Stalin was just a lot better at it. Old Major plays the role of Vladimir Lenin. The problem is that there's also a misunderstanding, and probably because what ends up happening is that because we didn't know a lot about, or the author, George Orwell, didn't know a lot about what happens behind the scenes, Vladimir Lenin is shown as the good guy. Mr. Frederick stands for that mid-century German that we're all familiar with. So these are ways that George Orwell has influenced the level of plot, or, layered a level of plot so that people can understand what's going on. So now Life of Pi, I'm actually not really familiar with this story. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this particular one, and there's not a lot when it comes to different elements. But for this, according to this article, the allegory is woven through the novel is meant as a mirror of the relationship with God. The author, Jan Martel, would argue that we don't always realize that God is present. When we do, we often try to escape him by living according to our own will. But in the end, a life in union with God is a happier one. Now, the basic premise of Life of Pi is the fact that there's a main character on a boat and there's a tiger underneath the tarp. He doesn't realize it at first because it's under the tarp. The problem is that when something we need to be careful with when we're talking about allegory is that when we create an allegory, it needs to be consistently making sense throughout the story. So for instance, a downfall or a weakness in this particular allegory that the author is talking about, when it's talking about God, typically what they're inferring here is that we're talking about the Judeo-Christian God, Yahweh. But it doesn't make a lot of sense for him to be relating the tiger to that God, because if we're talking about the Yahweh God, he's not necessarily seen as something that's going to be destroying or looking to gobble up man. Now, if you said that this was a metaphor for relationship with the universe and the power of the universe has around us, that makes a little bit more sense. That's just my opinion. But that's pretty much all I had for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please put them in the questions below. As always, I will be linking the resources I use in the descriptions below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.